I was born in Cleveland, Ohio on May 17th, 1934. In the midst of the Depression, and my relatives couldn't decide, relative to the Dust Bowl, which was worse, me or, or the Dust Bowl. But it was a typical life in the middle of the Great Depression. Fortunately, with the WPA, my mother was able to earn sufficient living because my father had a kind of a roving eye. He decided to start another family in another town. The last time I saw him, I was 2 years old. So Mama had to raise my brother and myself. Brother Harmon, 4.5 years my senior, had to raise us alone. And the things that I remember of those days, I think my favorite memory is sometime before I was 2 years old, and my father, who was working WPA, Works Projects Administration, a government program that got money into people's pockets. It was in some sort of construction work, I suppose, because he walked in one day with a wagon full of blocks, little various shapes, wooden blocks painted in various colors. And I was fascinated with those blocks. I remember that. I also remember the radio, which brought us Baby Snooks and all sorts of comedy characters. There was the musical episodes and all sorts of things. And all the rest of my life in Cleveland up to 1948 was characteristic growing up in Cleveland. In the midst of the Great Depression and through World War II. And rationing and all the rest of it, and a whole bunch of stuff you couldn't get unless you wanted to go to the black market, and that was always hazardous. Then following World War II, we relocated to 1948, we relocated to New York City. I lived out on Long Island, went to the School of Industrial Arts in New York, and finished my high school education at the School of Industrial Arts, and was graduated in 1953. And then in 57, we relocated again, driving across country in our first car to Los Angeles. And as a design draftsman, I had no difficulty in the years following World War II of getting a position with the aerospace industry as a design draftsman, compulsive model builder, and so on. And just went on living my life. There's nothing particularly exceptional about it, really, except I loved to tinker, and I took off in any direction I wanted, pursuing any will-o'-the-wisp that caught my fancy. The world was a great big sandbox with all the toys I could play with. It was wonderful. I had met Jobs when I was working at Atari. Jobs was never employed at Atari, but he was a consultant. He was selling new game designs to Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari and the creator of Pong. It was a very successful enterprise, and he was buying brand new games from Jobs, games that had been designed by Wozniak. And that's how that happened. And because every new game that came out, that came across my desk because I had to design the enclosures for them. So I knew all the engineers, and of course I knew Jobs. He was an interesting guy, and apparently he was somewhat enamored with me because of my background in various things. I had been involved in the establishment of companies earlier. And at any rate, he approached me one day, and he said he's having a problem with his friend, Mr. Wozniak, because they want to found a new company The problem was that Wozniak was enamored with all of the electronics that he was putting together, some very sophisticated stuff and fun stuff as far as he was concerned. But he was also very parental about the circuits that he was designing, so that he couldn't understand the concept of proprietary. And Jobs was having difficulty with Wozniak because Woz wanted to reserve the right to use some of the circuitry out of the new computer that they were producing for other applications, and no matter what Jobs did, he couldn't get Woz to quite get it through his head. Jobs was many things, but a diplomat was never one of them. You know what a diplomat is? That's a guy who can tell you to go to hell in a way that makes you look forward to the trip. Okay, well, he didn't have that talent. So he cornered me and he says, look, can you discuss the problem with Wozniak and get him to understand what proprietary means? I said, sure, no problem. So I invited him over to the apartment, and he sat down and we chatted. It took about 20 minutes. Woz was a reasonable guy. All you had to do was to explain it to him clearly enough, and he picked it up on the first bounce. Well, once he got that through his head as to the proprietary nature of his circuits, that was when Jobs jumped up and said, that's it, we're going to form a company. And we're going to call it Apple. I never did get an answer as to why that name, but that was his choice, and he wanted it. Okay, fine. Jobs and Woz would each have 45%, and I would have 10% as a tiebreaker in case there were disputes down the road between Jobs and Wozniak. Jobs felt that I would be able to come down on the side of reason and sort the thing out. So that's how Apple came into existence. That's how that worked. After about a dozen days of working with them, we founded the Apple Computer Company formally, registered at the Santa Clara County Registrar's Office, did all the filed a notice in the newspaper and all the rest of the things you had to do. And then there were some aspects of the business that made me think maybe there's some other way I ought to be going than this. I was perfectly willing to continue to work with them and help them because to them, they were in their 20s, I was in my 40s, and they came to regard me as some kind of mentor because of the experiences that I could bring into the relationship. And that was basically that. But there were several things. For instance, I had developed a system of documentation at Atari that Jobs was very impressed with, and essentially wanted me to do that sort of thing for his company. The problem was I knew that it was the right product at the right time and it was going to be profoundly successful. The only problem was, did I want to be in on it? I was a product development engineer in my own right, but at the same time, I knew I was standing in the shadow of giants. I would never have a chance to develop products because they were so far beyond my capabilities that that was never going to happen. In addition to which, Jobs was very impressed with the documentation system that I'd set up for Atari, and he was going to want me to head the documentation department in their Apple company or the corporation that would follow. And I did not see myself spending the next 20 years of my life shuffling papers in a big back room. That was not what I saw for myself. The contract, by the way, was something that Woz was most impressed with because when Jobs decided that we were going to form a company, I immediately sat down to my IBM Selectric typewriter with a 20-inch carriage and 88-character keyboard, and I typed up the contract for us, 3 pages of it, And it was interesting was you could have knocked his eyes off with a stick. He'd never seen somebody sit down and write a contract from beginning to end with everything that had to be done to make it work. Anyway, I continued to work with them after I had formally left the company. I think for several months after it, I continued to provide whatever assistance I could in helping them along. And then, of course, I simply drifted away into the rest of my life. That was it. Wozniak recognized that this was a company, not a corporation, which meant that we were the three of us liable for the responsibilities, the liabilities of the company. And when Jobs went out and sold 100 computers to a place called the Byte Shop, which was okay. That's exactly what he was supposed to do. He then went out also and did what he was supposed to do. He borrowed $15,000 to get the materials necessary to fill the order. The only problem was that several days after I found out about that, which was okay, somebody advised me that the Byte Shop had a terrible reputation for not paying their bills. In other words, there was a remote possibility that this whole thing could blow up. In which case, who's liable for the $15,000? Well, Jobs and Woz at that time didn't have two nickels to rub together. I, on the other hand, had a house, a car, a bank account. I was reachable. And in a company, we are individually and severally responsible for the liabilities of the company. In other words, I had 10% of the company, but I had 100% of the risk. And it was a factor, not the principal factor, but it was a factor in my decision to leave the company. And I continued to work with them afterwards in addition to that. In addition to which, they got a hold of a guy by the name of Arthur Rock, who was a finder. He's the kind of a guy that came along and found money for investment and companies worthy of investment and put the two together. And he found, as I understood it, $25 million to found the Apple Corporation. And Arthur Rock was a very unusual finder in that it had been my experience over the years that when you had money and ideas come together, money was always in the driver's seat. It's my money, I want to make sure it gets spent right. Arthur Rock was smarter than that. He made damn sure that the founding of the corporation, along with other people who were involved, the people they'd sell stock to and so on, that Jobs and Wozniak, between the two of them, would hold 51%. And that gave them control over the product design, the products themselves, and so on. The foundation of the business would be in the hands of the people who were smart enough to know what the products would be, how they would work, and the fact that they would work at all. The Apple logo, the first Apple logo, was not really a 20th century logo. It was a 19th century logo because what I wanted to do was to build an allegory. And that's what that is. It's an allegorical representation of the whole thing that we were doing. It contains reference, of course, to the apple and the logic of computers, etc., the Newton, a mind forever voyaging through strange seas of thought alone. That, to me, was a perfect expression of Jobs and Wozniak. And just a fun thing, that's all it did. It took me a day or two to pin that up. And I'm rather proud of it, and apparently it has become, much to my astonishment, a worldwide icon. I never expected when I was putting this together that that would ever happen. And that I'm most gratified about, I think. They were initials done in the lower right-hand corner of the drawing, hidden in the grass. Somehow or other, Jobs got sight of those initials in the grass and decided take them out. And I told him, it's your ball, your bat, and your park. You want me to take them out, I'll take them out. And I took them out. But I'm afraid that Mr. Jobs dipped a bit in my esteem with that request. But it was his product, and if that's what he wanted, that's fine. It's wonderful if somebody can say, what did I do in my lifetime? What have I accomplished? If the answer comes out nothing, it's pretty depressing. I think I got very, very lucky to be at the right place at the right time with the right capabilities to be able to accomplish things that most people cannot or could not. And I have made a name for myself in part through my efforts and in part because of the circumstances, for which I am most grateful. I wouldn't say no regrets. I'm as enamored with money as anyone else, and I haven't had a hell of a lot of it over the years. But no, I would say I've been an extremely fortunate person. I've been, as I say, at the right place at the right time with the right skills on more than one occasion over a series of, in conjunction with a series of strange coincidences that all seem to happen at the right place at the right time. Young people are always wondering at some point in time, what shall I do for a profession? And I always give them the same advice. Find some sort of work that you enjoy so much you'd be willing to do it for nothing, and you'll never work a day in your life because you'd be having too much fun. That is the message I have followed in my lifetime. As one example, I can tell you, I was working as chief engineer at a small electronics firm in Salinas, California, and I was there for 16 years as their chief engineer. I was their chief engineer because I was their only engineer. I was their chief draftsman for the same reason. But I was in that plant 7 days a week. Sundays, holidays meant nothing to me because I enjoyed what I was doing so much that I couldn't imagine doing anything else. My boss walked into the office one Sunday, found me at the drawing board. So, what the hell are you doing here, Wayne? I said, well, what am I supposed to do? Sit around the apartment and listen to my arteries harden? This is much more fun than anything else I could possibly want to do. And that's the philosophy I've followed all my life. The last quarter of Insolence of Office was my first serious attempt to write a treatise on the nature of money, to try and get people to understand not only how money works and why it works the way it does, but what was coming as a result of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. This book is the latest version of that attempt with all the improvements put on it. This is the book I've always wanted to write, and I've written it. It is based primarily on an understanding not only of where today's monumental inflation has come from, but where it's going. It came from Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, where 700 people from 40 allied nations were sent to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire for a conference that was intended to deal with the fact that World War II was the most expensive war in human history, and that more than half of these countries had already gone bankrupt. They had to do something if they were going to continue to pursue this war against Germany and Japan, and in the effort to make damn sure we don't speak German as a result of not having won the war. What were they going to do? Well, in those days, when you said you were out of money, what you really meant was you're out of gold. And virtually more than half of the countries of the world, certainly the Allied nations, had lost and burned up all the gold they had just fighting the war to a point in time, 1944, when they were winning. But they couldn't go any further unless something drastic was done. And what they did was to decide to take the world off the gold standard. And they would go to something called fiat money, money by decree, money that was money only because the governments of the world said it was money. There was only one problem with that. It solved the problem. It was the right decision at that particular point in time. The problem was, however, that they left the situation open-ended. There should have been a sunset clause when they took the world off the gold standard, so that so many years after the war was over, they would go back to the gold standard. The fact that they did not left the entire world on fiat money, money by decree, with no substance, no value. Gold and silver stopped being money for the first time in human history, modern human history. For the first time in 3,000 to 5,000 years, gold and silver stopped being money. As long ago as 1779, a man by the name of Adam Smith wrote a book called Wealth of Nations as a representative of the philosophers who were studying the nature of money at that time. Any country that goes to fiat money will suffer monetary inflation, monetary collapse, economic collapse, and probably political collapse along with it. In this particular case, however, the opinion was profoundly valid, as demonstrated 20 years after Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's book, had been published. A major country of Europe actually did go to fiat money, paper money, money based upon the numbers on a piece of paper. And the reason they did so is because they'd overthrown the French Republic, the French Kingdom, and turned it into a republic, the French Revolution in the 1790s. And then they discovered that the country was bankrupt. How do you run a country without money? So they decided to go to their argent, their paper notes. And of course, the rest of the world was running on gold and silver money, and they're running on paper notes that say, I am 1 franc, and that's it. Okay. The problem was, who's going to have any faith in their currency if it's just a piece of paper? And their response was, well, we will back our currency with the value of confiscated land. And how you divide up an acre of land among 5 franc notes, I don't know. For all practical purposes, it was fiat money. And it fell right into the discussion in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And sure enough, 18 months after they had done this, the country experienced a monumental inflation, which probably for political purposes, they issued new paper money with bigger numbers. And of course, over the next 10 years, they had 5 or 6 very serious inflationary episodes until finally the whole house of cards came down, and even Robespierre himself, who had been a founder of the revolution, wound up on the guillotine. And all they had done was to set themselves up for Napoleon. And Napoleon had been watching all this happen over a span of 10 years. And almost as his first edict as Emperor of France, his comment was simple. Hereafter, France will pay its debts in gold or not at all. Well, France didn't have any gold. Well, that didn't bother him. We'll pay our debts with Finland's gold and Sweden's gold and everybody else's gold, and proceeded to then set France on the course of conquest. And they conquered Europe. And that, of course, worked fine as a solution to the French problem until he tried to invade Russia in winter. And that was the beginning of the end of the Napoleonic era. Okay, this was my autobiography, written in 2010. And I'd like you to, this is the epilogue. And rather than bore you with the entire epilogue, I'll give you just the last paragraph. But one final thought does remain. Among the blessings that have graced my life is the fact that I was fortunate enough to have drawn lucky on the genetic pool. My health still holds, and my capacity for ambitious dreams and hopes remains undiminished. In short, if the fates are kind and the wind blows in the right direction, there may well be more thrilling adventures yet to come before that last bell tolls. And I've been somewhat enamored with Omar Khayyam. We are no other than a moving row of magic lantern shapes that come and go, round with a sun-loomed lantern held at midnight by the master of the show. We're naught but pieces of the game he plays, here upon this checkerboard of nights and days, as hither and thither he moves, and checks, and slays, and one by one back into the closet lays.